Okay, so here is the agenda for the morning. Laura is going to start off with an overview of CREP. It's been a little while since we had the CREP 101 training, so she is going to go over some of the basics. And then she's going to talk about an overview of incentives and signing bonuses, and she'll talk about cost share for CREP. Then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then I will do a presentation on the planning process for CRP and CREP. I'll touch on the environmental review. I'll review the checklist and then just give some general updates and reminders. Then we'll just transition back to Laura, and she is going to talk about status reviews and re-enrollment. So I think that is it for the agenda. So I am going to hand it over to Laura. I think Laura does not have a working camera today, so unfortunately you won't see her face, but she is going to present first.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Let me go ahead and just grab my PowerPoint and see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Sorry, I don't know how long it will be before I finally stop struggling with this. One moment. Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Looks like we're still seeing, I don't think we're seeing the presentation side.
No, okay. Yeah, I really don't like the view of this. Let me fix this. Sorry, but I guess there's still a lot of people coming in, so maybe it's not the worst thing.
Yeah.
I know I don't want to bring my email up. Okay, this is the view I like. How is that? Almost ready home. Sorry, from beginning. Okay, is that a normal full screen view?
Yeah, that one looks right.
All right, cool. Yes. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the lack of camera. Maybe it's not the worst thing because I think it makes me more awkward when I know I can be seen. But I figure if something's going to break the day before a meeting with more than 100 people, at least it's my webcam and not the computer itself. So when we talked about doing this, I thought, oh man, do we need to do that again? It feels like enough hasn't changed and it feels repetitive, but I forget that we have so many new people all the time from FSA, from MDA, from NRCS, the Soil Conservation District, DNR, there's always turnover. So what I ask, I guess, is that if you bear with me, if you've been here for a while, if you've been working with this program far longer than me and you feel like, why are we talking about the same thing? Just help or just keep in mind that there are a lot of new people and we're trying to bring everyone up to speed. So you might just need to bear with us there. And the other thing is that we're getting it closer to the end of this farm bill and a lot more could change. So maybe we should relish in the fact that there's not a whole lot different right now, but I hope you find the training worthwhile and, we'll go from there. So like Julie said, we'll start with some basics, go over cost share, incentives, and just a few bits of key information. So the basics, CRP, it's a voluntary program where we essentially have contracts with ag producers so that environmentally sensitive land isn't farmed, but instead we install conservation practices. We basically rent their land from them. So they install resource, conserving plant cover like grass or trees to control erosion, reduce runoff, and create habitat for wildlife. The contracts are between 10 and 15 years. We pay annual rental payments and essentially rent that land from them. And then we pay cost share to establish the practice. And the program was started in 1985. So CRP can be kind of a headache sometimes, and that's because there's growing pains with the program. I mean, it's been around for a long time. I'm not the only thing pushing 40. FSA administers CRP, while technical support is provided by NRCS and subsequently MDA, DNR, and the Soil Conservation District. So overall, it's a pretty unique program because I can't think of a whole lot of programs where different agencies work that closely together to make a program function. So it is pretty unique to use, the technical skills of one agency and the administrative ones of another. Overall, the purpose is to reduce soil erosion, improve water quality, and provide habitat for wildlife. So we have a wide array of practices, but they all circle back to, having the same purpose. So there's everything from conservation cover, we have buffers, we have tree plantings, pollinator plantings, a whole slew of stuff. And Julie will talk more about some of them. There's a couple different types of CRP, and this can be confusing, but there's general CRP, which in Maryland will kick off on February 27th. And this is where participants can offer land during an announced enrollment period, and it's competitive, and they basically submit a bid, and not everyone gets accepted. The secretary will accept they will rank all the offers and then accept certain ones. So we don't have a whole lot of that in Maryland, but it's enough that we have to have an awareness of it and be prepared for it. And we do create a lot of offers at FSA, just not all of them are accepted. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's continuous CRP, where land can be enrolled at any time, and the offers aren't subject to competitive bidding. So if someone qualifies, their land qualifies, and they qualify as a person or an entity, then they can participate. And then there's CREP, which is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which is continuous re-enrollment, meaning if they qualify, they can enroll, but there's higher incentives, there are additional signing incentives, and additional cost share and incentives from the state of Maryland. So basically, we pool our money together, we work on it together, and it is absolutely the most popular type of CRP in Maryland, and the overwhelming majority of our acres are in CREP. So that is certainly what we will talk about the most today. The other type of CRP enrollment that's competitive is CRP grasslands, and it's where it always happens right after general CRP, and there's batching periods, and it's competitive. And this one's a little bit unique, and we'll talk about it more when it opens up. Usually they announce it towards the end of general CRP once they have a gauge of participation. So I think we have about 1,000 acres of it in Maryland, so it's not super popular, but it's something. And it's nice for land without cropping history. Then there's Clear 30, which is continuous enrollment, and this is new. It was a pilot, and then they made it permanent. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but it's basically CRP for 30 years instead of 10 to 15. And yeah, we'll talk about that later. To be eligible as a person or as an entity, people have to have owned the land for 12 months, either before the close of the general sign up or at the time they make their offer. With NRCS, the term is more often application, but when we say offer, it's basically an application. They're offering up their land to us. The other way they could participate is if they acquire the land because someone died and left it to them. There's a few other unique circumstances that might have to go through our deputy administrator farm program. So there's always, exceptions and things like that, but not as common. And operators, it's not just landowners that can submit offers. Operators can as well, but there's a few caveats and things they need to consider to kind of safeguard themselves and their finances. And despite, my old bad joke here, despite what they say in Yellowstone, the program is, structured to try and prevent people just from buying land and then putting it in CRP. And that's one of the reasons they want people to have owned the land for 12 months. There's a couple key things we look at for land eligibility. And it needs to have a cropping history. So it needs to be planted for 4 out of 6 years from 2012 to 2017. Those were the years that came out with the 2018 Farm Bill. So when we have a new Farm Bill in another year or two, or whenever it rolls out, they will probably update the cropping history. And then those are the years we'll have to focus on. The other key thing is that it has to be physically and legally capable of being planted in a normal manner. So no weird zigzagging around, tons of trees or anything like that. We typically say that if they can't do it with normal equipment and no normal farmer would, try to farm that land, then it's not going to work. So these are two of the primary requirements. So if there's not a cropping history and they can't crop it, then it's not a fit for CRP. But the exception to this, of course, would be grasslands, because you don't need a cropping history. And then marginal pasture land is absolutely an exception, and that's more common on the Western Shore. In trade for renting their land, we make annual rental payments every October. The payments are supposed to be based on the relative productivity of the soil within each county. So they stay sort of competitive, but not too competitive. We don't want to have CRP out competing local farmers and push people off their land, but we want to make it enticing enough that people can afford to participate. And then in return for renting their land, we expect that they maintain the cover and complete a management activity. For cost share, FSA will pay 50% cost share. The rates vary by county, and we'll talk about that. For CREP, the state pays an additional 37.5%, but right now things are much more enticing, and Max is paying more, which we'll also talk about. And then there's a signing incentive payment we call CIP. And for most practices, that's $100 for CREP, but for CP23 and CP23A, the wetland restorations, that's $150 per acre incentive payment. Then we also pay something called PIP for CREP, which is 40% of the total eligible cost of practice installation. And then on top of that, for new enrollments and re-enrollments, the state of Maryland pays $100 per acre signing incentive. But right now, Maryland is paying more than that for certain practices, which we'll again talk about more. I certainly am not going to read this chart to you out of respect for your time, but we have a couple sheets like this that NRCS graciously maintains, and they are a huge help. It's like the only thing that I keep laminated and hang on to, and I always will because it's just really helpful. So this is kind of like a one-stop shop to see what the practices are and some of the basics for it. So we have one of these for CREP. So you can see the practices along with the practice code. Since we do have a variety of people, I'll try not just to talk in the practice code because that's annoying. But you can also see how the FSA practice code correlates with the NRCS practice code, which is important because that's, we have two different groups here. Then there's another one for continuous CRP. And these are, Julie maintains these now, and they're in the FOTG that NRCS maintains. And for FSA staff, it's just on the World Wide Web, so anybody can find it. One of the other trade-offs for receiving the annual rental payments is completing maintenance on the property. We do expect them to perform maintenance without additional funds throughout the life of the contract. So we're essentially renting their land, and there is an expectation that they maintain the contract. And we want to make sure we convey these expectations to them. We do not want to set them up by failure by giving the impression when we're talking about the program that, it's a plant it and forget it kind of approach. We don't want them to think that that's how it works, or we'll just set them up for expensive issues down the road. They're also expected to perform a management activity during the contract, with some exceptions. And then cost share is no longer available unless it's an older contract for management. So that's something people need to consider. The revenue from annual rental payments is lessened with the activities. It costs them money. They had to put money back into it. So when we're talking to people about the program, we need to make them aware that they're expected to do maintenance and management, and all the revenue that they received in October, it's not all going to be able to be used for taxes or whatever they want, because there are going to be inputs on their part too. Just for some context of enrollment in Maryland, right now we have about 41,000 acres in CREP. 607 in general, 760 in continuous. Grasslands about 1,100. I like to round up to make myself feel better. And then in Clear 30, we have 25 acres. So the numbers have definitely drastically dropped in Maryland, which is obviously not popular in terms of trying to meet WIP goals or, pacify some of our most enthusiastic external partners. But it's where we are. And what I like to try to remember is that due to a lot of the easements, both from the state of Maryland, from nonprofits, there's a lot of CRP cover that does remain planted, but it's just no longer under a CRP contract with us. So when we're gauging our success, we do want to keep that in mind. And the other thing we now do, FSA humors me at the county offices, and now we track the reason that people choose not to re-enroll, so we can kind of see trends and see long-term what we might need to do to try to retain some more acres. Just for another kind of context for people who are a little bit newer to it, this just shows you a quick graphic. I'll send these slides out later if you want to look at it more closely. But it just shows where some of our, where our acres are and in which county. And some of them might surprise you. I didn't realize that Worcester had 1,800 acres of riparian buffers. So wow. But then some of them, don't surprise you. I know that Queen Anne's has a ton of filter strips, things like that. So you can just take a look if you're interested. And this is both continuous and CREP in general, just kind of a breakdown of what we have. For this coming year, in terms of workload, the same offices are kind of feeling it again this year. Queen Anne's and Dorchester, they'll never really get a break. There's a lot going on. Kent's going to be extra busy this year with re-enrollments. So these are the re-enrollments that each office will be dealing with this year, and the total acres that could potentially expire. Now to talk briefly about incentives, CIP, which I mentioned for CREP. CREP is tricky sometimes, and it's a lot to keep track of. It really is for field office and county office staff. It's a lot because for CREP, we vary from the national handbook in a lot of ways. So you have to remember, okay, what's different about CREP versus in the national handbook? And one of the things we have to remember is that we have a different SIP payment. And it's a one-time incentive payment made to participants that enroll in certain practices. It's only on new acres. And it's for some of the most common CRP practices. They'll get this $100 per acre or $150 per acre for the wetland restorations. And not every practice gets SIP, but just some of them. And you can see here, it's the shallow water area, the marginal pasture land buffers, riparian buffers, and filter strips. They receive the 100. Then what varies, so if you just go look in the National 2 CRP handbook, you'll see that SIP is calculated as 32.5% of the first full year annual rental payment. So this isn't something, we don't have a lot. You heard me say we have 607 acres in continuous CRP right now. So there's not people, pounding on the door to enroll in continuous CRP. So this is just for quick awareness. So you know that there's a difference. And you know that if you're working with a producer who's interested in continuous, okay, there's something different about continuous versus CREP. So let me go look that up or check with FSA or whatever it is. So you can see that at the first full year's annual rental payment is $2,000. The SIP would be $650. So in most cases, I like to think they're better off with our CREP SIP, but there could be others where they make out better under continuous. Okay, so for PIP, PIP is a one-time incentive payment made to participants that enroll in land and CRP to be devoted to continuous sign-up practices. So for CREP, we pay PIP for shallow water areas, filter strips, riparian buffers, wetland practices, and then the marginal pasture land buffers. And they're 40% of the total eligible costs. One great thing about PIP for CREP is that it doesn't count towards cost share. Nationally, they changed PIP, so it counts towards the cost share. So it kind of counts against the 100% they can receive. One of the things FSA is tasked with is making sure that no one is paid more than 100% of their installation costs. So if it costs them $5,000 to install something, we can't pay them $5,500, and the PIP would count against that, and we'd have to reduce it further. So that's one good thing we have going for us with CREP. Now, one thing I want to mention that does kind of vary from what we talked about last year. We've talked about this, I think, NRCS has talked about it some with Julie, and I've talked about it with FSA staff. But right now, there's so many extra incentives. Well, Max is paying more, which we'll talk about in my slides, maybe aren't in the best order. But Max is paying 50% cost share on a lot of practices. And then we have FSA paying the normal 50%. So Max went from 37.5% to 50%. And then we also have a lot of external partners. When I say external partners, I really just mean groups like Shore Rivers, Lower Shore Land Trust. I'm not really factoring in, when I say external, I just mean outside of MDA, I guess, and DNR. But anyway, we have a lot of people pushing a lot of money towards CREP right now, which is fine, but it just means that we have to consider even more carefully what we're paying and how we're paying it. So with that said, PIP is calculated as 40% of the eligible cost of installation after subtracting any state cost share. So that means it's 40% of the producer's actual cost. So if they receive max cost share, or if a nonprofit like Shore Rivers put in money, that's fine, but we just can't pay them a bonus on that. We had one person that I think was going to receive, I didn't put examples in here because this is a 2.5-hour training. I'm not trapping you all day, but we had somebody who was going to have like $50,000 worth of cost share, and they didn't have to pay anything between, I think, a nonprofit and the state and MDA. And we were about to pay them PIP for, I can't do math. I don't know, it was like 20-some thousand dollars or whatever. So it didn't sit right. And so we were looking back at our policy and realized that this has been the policy all along. I think sometimes we're like, oh, come on, is this another change of interpretation? Like, what are you guys doing to us up there at the state office? But really, this was the policy all along. We just didn't realize it or interpret it, I'd say, correctly, because we didn't have all this extra cost share flowing in. So we just didn't really think about it. So we're not going back and looking at anything prior, but it has been in the handbook all along, and we just weren't seeing it. So this is not new. It just became more relevant lately with so much more cost share going out, as other groups and the state, works hard to install more conservation cover. So continuous PIP is different. Again, not much continuous, just something you want to keep in mind for your own working knowledge. If you're working with somebody, PIP right now is at 50% of the establishment cost. This can change at the secretary's discretion. It is considered a cost share payment, so it counts against the 100%. Just keep that in mind. Let's see, the Maryland signing bonus for CREP right now, it's $100 per acre, and it comes from the state of Maryland, except for riparian buffers, which we call CP22. That is actually a cool $1,000 per acre right now. It's not a permanent change to our actual legal CREP agreement, but it's something MDA is doing until 2031. The higher one is only for new enrollments. And this is already in effect, so it's already happening. The other thing is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is very passionate about riparian buffers and installing them. And so in some cases, they're also paying an additional $1,000 per acre signing incentive to install new buffers in Carroll, Frederick, and Washington. So it's not a guarantee by any means, but if you are in those counties and you're installing or you're helping someone sign up for CREP, for CP22, you definitely want to be aware of this. And if you're not already aware of the person, feel free to let me know and I can help connect the both of you because they definitely have an interest in working with people to help on the technical side, but also financially trying to incentivize new riparian buffers in those counties. Like I mentioned, normal CREP policy is that participants can receive an extra 37.5% on most practices. But right now, the state of Maryland is paying up to 100% on high priority conservation practices until June 30th of 2026. So FSA is still paying our 50%, but rather than MDA doing 37.5%, they're going to close that gap and pay the remaining 50%. And this is already underway. The practices that are eligible for up to 50% for max, you can see here, I won't, read it all to you, but then there's a few that are only eligible for normal FSA cost share. CRP cost share can't exceed 100% of the cost of the practice. FSA has to be mindful of how much max cost share a producer will receive. And then, like I was saying, the cost share from outside groups will also need to be considered. But it should be less. Well, I thought that it would be less of an issue if groups know the federal and state government will be covering the full 100%. But, we have some passionate nonprofits out there that are still willing to pay. So it's kind of null and void. I should not even make that comment anymore. But if FSA is asking a lot of questions to understand what other means of cost share are provided, it's for this reason, and it's because it's our responsibility. We're the ones giving the money out. And it feels good to give the money out sometimes, but I will tell you, it's the worst to get it back. So we try to get it right the first time so we don't have to ask for it back when it's already out and, it's spent. So what I leave to the service centers to decide is, how to communicate to ensure that the cost share doesn't exceed 100%. It's definitely easier said than done, and you'll have to be organized and you'll have to communicate well, but you'll have to talk about, okay, well, this component's going on here on the FSA 848, this one's going on the max cost share agreement, or, okay, FSA is paying 50% of this one, max will pay 50% of this one. You all will have to talk about that. And admittedly, it's not easy, but it's just something we have to be mindful of and kind of a side effect of that extra money. Along those lines, each service center can create and manage their own process for making sure that the state signing incentive is paid. FSA does provide the contract to the sign up bonus coordinator, but if there's any other issues, like if somebody's saying they didn't receive it, then we do ask the MDA does that follow up and talks to the person, and handles it from there. Each service center can also create their own procedure for communicating to MDA that a contract has been partially or fully terminated. So MDA can decide if they want to require a refund, puts FSA in kind of a weird spot for that. So we ask that, we're going to pass that ball to you, and then you guys, it'll be in your court. You decide how you want to handle it. We don't have much flexibility. If a contract is terminated, we have to, go through our formal process. You all might have a little bit more latitude. So we're going to tell you about it and back off and let you take it from there. But we do ask overall that for max cost sharing, things like that, that we try to create a dialogue between FSA and MDA to make sure that producers don't slip through the cracks and miss their chance to fill out a max application. And then, of course, overall, MDA is responsible for talking to the producer about max. We already have like 1,000 pages of CRP rules, so we don't want to mess up anything with yours. Take care. All right, how I'm doing on time. Okay. For cost share, we do pay cost share, and they are intended to assist in the establishment of the practices and any of the required components on the conservation plan. So basically, we pay to install the practice, and we pay 50%. Our rates are individual for, every county has their own rates. We have a county committee system. So our county committee is a group of locally elected farmers who oversee the offices in a lot of different ways. And I won't, go into too many tangents there, but essentially this small group of producers that are elected, they review the rates each year. And then the state committee reviews and approves and makes sure that the rates are consistent across county lines. So they make sure that the rates are logical, and they approve them and oversee them. Some counties you will find their rates are basically the same as the Soil Conservation District, and in other cases, they're drastically different. So we are tasked with coming up with our own rates, but if they choose to accept the same rates because they're logical and they know that the Soil Conservation Board, has poured over them and they're accurate, that's fine. That's their choice, but you won't see that in every office. So if you see FSA with this, completely separate list, don't be annoyed. They're just doing their job. Let's see, FSA uses the percentage of cost not to exceed per unit of measure, and the limitation is supposed to be the average cost of performing the unit. Some older agreements for management may have a flat rate still, but otherwise it's all percentage of cost. We used to be able to play, I think it was either just 50% or a flat rate, or we could do percentage of cost, but in the last year or two, we were told you have to switch to percentage of cost not to exceed. So we can't align, we don't pay based on a normal flat rate system like a lot of, the technical side of the office is used to. The other thing is that we've also switched to paying on individual components, and you will barely see any offices remaining that pay on practice codes. There's a few hanging out there still for certain practices, but overall we pay based on individual components. FSA is tasked with, or basically for cost share, we can only pay on the minimum specs and quantities required by the conservation plan. So we need to use the most cost-effective way to address the resource concern. Sometimes technical partners will have proposals that go way above and beyond. It could be something like, they want to do a pollinator mix where a warm season grass mix would do the trick, and there's a $600 difference. So producers can go above and beyond, and that's fine, but it needs to be at their own expense. And NRCS still needs to be willing to put it in the conservation plan, and everybody still needs to sign off on the plan. And then what we would need is a cost estimate that breaks out, okay, here's the part of it that is necessary just to meet standards and specs, and here's the Cadillac side of it, which is going above and beyond. And overall, we create our cost share agreement based on what's in the conservation plan. More often than not, for the engineering practices, we need a cost estimate that really breaks out the exact components and amounts and things like that. But we're pulling from the cost estimate, we're pulling, the pounds of seed from the IR sheets and things like that. So we definitely need that technical expertise to tell us what's needed to establish the practice and how much of it, because that's what we based our cost share on. And if anybody is going above and beyond and creating Cadillac designs, we need to have those broken out, because we can't pay on something that goes way above and beyond. For our cost share paperwork, you'll hear us call it basically 848s, and there's 3 parts. We have the application, which we don't do a whole lot with, but then we have the 848A, which is the agreement, and that shows how much cost share they're approved for. And then we have the 848B, which is the performance where they certify performance and where we, figure out exactly how much they're getting paid. So when someone completes the work, when the practice is installed, they come in and they sign the form to say, hey, I did it, and it has to be filed in a timely manner. And then what we do is we ask NRCS to verify the practice is completed and that it meets standards and specs. And after both the producer said they've completed it and NRCS is certified performance, then we sign off and we can pay. If it's in the conservation plan, there could be cost share paid for one weed or insect control application if the COC says it's necessary, and if it's in the conservation plan. It can't happen during primary nesting season, and this is in addition to anything that was done when the cover was initially installed. Let's see, it needs to be done within the first 12 months, but there are some exceptions, like if it's a tree planting, they can have up to the first 24 months. Overall, for re-enrollments, we don't pay cost share on re-enrollments. There's a few exceptions at this point, but they're few and far between. And really the only example we have that actually kind of rings true in Maryland is grass waterways that might need grading and reseeding based on normal wear and tear. But other than that, as much as I know we'd like to in some situations, we don't pay cost share at the time of re-enrollment. The national office made that pretty clear a few years ago when we had been paying it. And, if it circles back at one point because the aging of the program, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that down the road, but that's certainly not the case at this point. For some of you out there who are kind of in the weeds of the program, we have some questions up with the national office waiting to see if certain things will be appropriate, but nothing yet. For soil rental rates, when we calculate the rates, we use certain incentives for certain practices, and that's how we get the higher payments. So if you have a riparian buffer, wetland restoration, you'll have the soil rental rate will be calculated based on 200%. For filter strips, rare and declining habitat and wildlife habitat buffers, it's 150%, 100% for shallow water areas and the marginal pasture land buffers, and then 80% for introduced grasses, native grasses, tree plantings, and HEL CP4D. So because I'm hustling on this first one to make sure we have time for things other than intro, I'm not going to spend as much time on this as I did last year, but basically FSA uses the Terra software to calculate the top 3 soils in the offered acreage. And then that's where we apply the incentives. Sometimes we pay a very small maintenance payment. We add that in, and ultimately we come up with the maximum payment rate per acre. So we take the weighted average soil rental rate and the total incentives, and then we come up with the maximum payment rate per acre. One thing I do want to mention, just because I know FSA is on the line, is just a reminder that each fall we are tasked with, Bobby thing's kind of interrupting. We are tasked with reviewing our soil rental rates to make sure that they're kind of commensurate with what people would pay to rent out land and that they're not out competing. And the national office sends us a list of existing, soil rental rates, dry land rates, and says, okay, we think that they should be increased or decreased. And they base that off of the results from the NASS survey. And then the COC is given the opportunity to say, hey, that is way too high. No one's going to be able to afford to farm around here. Or they say, come on, it's way too low. No one's going to participate in CRP. And they're given a chance to advocate for higher or lower or essentially an alternative rate. It's a tough crowd. We don't usually sway anyone because the NASS data is something they feel so strongly about. But either way, my point is that the rates are about to change. So I think Talbot's rates are going to stay the exact same, if I remember correctly, but otherwise the rates for everyone else are about to change. Not drastically, so not enough that's going to make someone want to get in the program or get out of the program if they're, considering signing up. But those re-enrollment offers that are being run, it could change any day, or if you have a new offer. So with general CRP starting on the 27th, I expect that we will see those rates any day. So just a reminder, if you're creating offers for re-enrollments, trying to get ahead because that's how we survive around here, they will be changing any day. Okay, for management for CRP, just a quick little refresher here. In a normal world, you might think about maintenance and management as synonyms, but in CRP, because it's complicated, there is an important distinction. Maintenance is an ongoing responsibility that begins once the cover is established, and their ongoing activities to keep the cover intact. So they're mowing, they're spraying, or they're burning, but they need to keep the cover maintained and keep noxious and invasive species out of out of the field. If they have grass cover, they need to keep the trees out. Maintenance is done without cost share, and it's in accordance to the conservation plan. And this is where we really count on planners to work with the producer to talk about their options. We get stuck in the rut of everybody mows on August 16th every year. Everybody mows on August 16th. But there are alternatives and different ways they can handle weeds. So those are, where we really count on you guys. Each CRP participant is required to perform one management activity during the life of their contract, with a few exceptions. And the intent of management is that it's to prolong or improve plant diversity and habitat of the CRP practice. So they're site specific and they're intended to benefit wildlife. We don't pay cost share for management activities anymore. If a contract was approved before sign up 52, they are still eligible for cost share. So some of the people doing management now are getting paid for it. But ones that have re-enrolled or signed up recently are not going to receive cost share for management. So it's something they need to be aware of. But in terms of workload, producers are still required to complete management activities for most practices. And circling back to the workload part, that means FSA is still creating the cost share paperwork for it. And it actually just says $0, but that's because this is how we track the management. And then we still need NRCS to certify the completion of the activity on the 848B. So if you get an 848B, say your district con hands it to you and asks you to go out and look and see if it's there, it's not because we're hard up for something to do, but we need you to certify that performance so that person's obligation can be met. The management needs to be in the conservation plan. And we need to explain this expectation to them. So and make sure they're actually paying attention when we go through the plan so they understand like, oh, I do need to actually do something with this down the road. FSA will send them a letter and communicate with them, but this definitely makes the conservation plan important, not just at the time of installation, but down the road too, because you're giving them that guidance of what they'll do. For management timeframes, if it's a 10-year contract, it needs to be done by the end of year 6. If it's 15 years, it needs to be done by the end of year 9. If they choose one of the in-between years, like 11, 12, 13, or 14, we have a sliding scale. If somebody needs more time, we have some latitude for extensions, but there's a process for it, and they need to go through FSA and ask for more time. And we can give them usually one extension, but I'd say through FSA. But anyway, for FSA staff, we need to always use the final day of the fiscal year on your 848 agreement. It'll save you from ending up on the 100 reports I feel like I send you. So if the contract starts on 10/1/17, then the expiration date for a 10-year contract will be 9/30 of 2023. And if it's a 15-year contract, then the expiration date will be 9/30 of 2026, because we do everything on the fiscal year. We can only go beyond that year 6 and year 9 mark if there's an extension on file, but we can never pay in the last 3 years of the contract. That's one important thing. The conservation plan does need to have the specific year in which the activity must take place and the specific activity. You can't just say, complete one of the required activities. What we need during the planning process is you to work with the producer and say, hey, you think you want to light disc? Or you think you want to overseed, or what equipment do you have? What's your skill level? What do you want? And, give them an opportunity for input. And we can't approve the conservation plan or the contract subsequently without these key pieces of information. There are some exemptions. Nationwide, grassland CRP doesn't have to complete management. And then we did have a request approved initially a few years ago, and then some more recently, to exempt a few activities from completing management activities. So this went into effect for contracts approved on or after July 2nd of 2020. And so if somebody had a conservation plan where management was required, but now their specific activity doesn't require it, that's okay. But we just need to have the conservation plan modified to pull that out. I don't think that needs to be fancy. I think we could probably just do a pen and ink change where everybody writes on there, this isn't needed anymore. And most of the time, if people aren't required to do it, they probably won't want to do it, but we want to be careful about just assuming someone doesn't want to do it, because we gave them an 848 agreement that said, hey, you'll get this cost share, and told them they could do it. And there are a few people out there who actually want to go above and beyond. So we don't want to squash that opportunity unless they ask. This is something I'm going to roll through really quickly for the sake of time, but this is a list that is maintained in the field office tech guide, and it details every single CRP practice, and then if management is required or not required. Most of or more often than not, it's contingent on whether it's the initial contract or re-enrollment. the type of practices, and then beyond that, certain parts of the practice may not require management. So that's important to keep in mind. And it's also important in terms of planning, because that means for something like a CP9 shallow water area, when the IR sheet is being completed, it's important for us to know, how much is in the buffer, how much is in the pool area, how much is in the berm, because it helps us figure out for management just how much to include on the 848A. So this is just a look at the chart, which shows when management is required and not required. Typically, the native grass practices don't require management in the initial contract, which is great because it gives that time to actually establish before we disturb it. Before we had this, staunch approach, and we were forced to you'll find something to do, even though we knew we were actually, adversely impacting the cover. So policy finally caught up a little bit with common sense in that regard. So there are situations where it's not required. And this is all in the field office tech guide that Julie graciously handles the CRP side of. And just some more charts that you can use. Definitely the technical staff, but then FSA, when they're reviewing a conservation plan and just having the working knowledge of the program, they can be aware of the different options. So we have a pre-approved list of activities. And these also had to be vetted with FSA's national office. And I'm sure they use technical support behind the scenes, but they basically say, okay, if you have a CP3, these are your choices. These are acceptable. And it describes the activity. So Steve created these a while back, and now Julie maintains it. And there are some updates, which Julie sent out a while back, and I sent out to FSA staff. Let's see. This part I'm going to make really fast. So this is just a Clear 30 refresher. So Clear 30 was a pilot program at the advent of the 2018 Farm Bill, and then it became, I guess, permanent, at least for now. And it's giving practices that are expiring an opportunity to enroll for 30 years. So if somebody has a water quality practice that's expiring, they can go for 30 years instead of re-enrolling into another 10 or 15-year contract. CREP does qualify. And so the practices that are eligible in Maryland for Clear 30 are grass waterways, filter strips, riparian buffers, the wetland restorations, and the marginal pasture land buffers. So those would be the common ones anyway. We don't have a whole lot of activity. 2 years ago, we had 5 contracts re-enroll into Clear 30, nothing last year. And the state of Maryland is offering $1,000 signing bonus, I think, which helps a lot. A CREP participant who has a contract expiring on September 30th, they can enroll into Clear 30 instead of re-enrolling into CREP. Expanded buffers are fine. They don't have to conform to continuous CRP and scale their buffer back or anything like that, as long as the original enrollment was correct. We do want the participant to kind of weigh their pros and cons of each program. So we should provide them the facts okay, here's, your CREP, and here's what it would be for CREP, here's what it'd be for Clear 30. You decide, because there's a lot of things they have to consider. CREP has much higher rental rates. Their annual payment would be higher in October, and it's for 10 to 15 years. And there's, a normal state signing incentive payment. Clear 30 usually, or it does pay less, but it includes money for maintenance and management. So if somebody is gung-ho and they do like going out there and going above and beyond and truly working hard to maintain that cover and make it the best it can be, they might like it because there's a lot of cost share available there. But it does mean that they have to be in the program for 30 years. And 30 years is a long time when refunds are due if a contract is terminated early. So my personal opinion is that's why we don't see a whole lot of people going into Clear 30, because 30 years is a long time. And the only easy way out of CRP is death. So if they decide to sell that land in year 27, they very well may be on the hook for 27 years worth of payments to repay, which is a lot for some people to stomach. So there's certainly perks to it, like having, a guaranteed 30-year enrollment. Around here, and really nationwide, we've had a CRP around for so long that I think we take it for granted and we've accepted that it'll be here forever, but who knows what the future will hold. So it's a guaranteed 30-year enrollment, but at the same time, they're also locked into the same rate for 30 years, where maybe if they signed up for CREP, that rate would continue to go higher. We don't know. The sign up for it ends July 31st, 2023. Like I said, expiring contracts are eligible. The sign up of July 31, that's the final day for offers this year. So it's the same deadline as normal re-enrollment offers. Just for a quick comparison, you can see here if somebody does CREP for 10 to 15 years versus if they do Clear 30 for 30 years, you can kind of see the incentives for each. But ultimately, for an example, I pulled at one point, if somebody had a 2.8 contract, or excuse me, 2.8 acre filter strip in Dorchester, for CREP, theirs ended up being $312, and maintenance and management would be at their own expense. If they did Clear 30, for 30 years, their annual rental payment was $170, but they did get maintenance and management funds provided. So that would be one of those situations where we don't want to tell them what to do by any means, but I know the field offices are already stretched very thin, but if somebody expresses interest in Clear 30, in my opinion, the best thing to do is run a tariff scenario for CREP, run a tariff scenario for Clear 30, give them a fact sheet for each and let them decide. If someone does follow through with it, then NRCS will need to complete monitoring site visits every 3 years for all of the contracts. And then we'd modify the conservation plan as needed. If maintenance is needed, then they'd need to put it in the conservation plan, and then FSA can pay. So Clear 30 would pay for practice establishment or reestablishment as the cover ages, management, maintenance, excuse me. Sorry, it's almost like I've been talking without breathing for an hour. Hold on. All right. Away from Clear 30, because, trying to fit a lot into a little time here. Should have just trapped y'all for a whole day so I could breathe a little. For changing practices, this is something that's kind of hairy in the past, so I just want to take a minute to explain it when we have everyone in the area, or kind of remind everybody where it stands. So we don't have as much latitude to change practices as we thought we did a couple years ago. But we're not looking back at prior decisions. We're just keeping it going from here on out. So for general CRP, it's pretty much the only kind of CRP where we can change things. It can be changed from a general CRP practice to a continuous CRP practice or CREP, but only at the time of re-enrollment. So paragraph 181F in 2CRP gives a couple examples. For continuous CRP, the practice can't be changed at any time during the contract, nor at the time of re-enrollment. And then same thing for CREP. The practice can't be changed at any time during the contract, nor at the time of re-enrollment. We used to permit modifications if it was basically an even better practice, if you will, like if it was a grass filter strip to a tree filter strip and they were doing it at their own cost. But, well, the national office told us we had the wrong interpretation there, and, schooled us with references, and now we know. Excuse me. Okay, one other thing I want to whiz through, because it's not going to apply for very long, but I want to mention it, is the forest management incentives. We call that FMI. The 2018 Farm Bill provided authority to the Secretary to offer forest management activities. I think they realized basically that we had a lot of, riparian buffers enrolled across the nation, but we weren't doing a whole lot with them. So they decided to, make a lot of money available for people to promote forest management and enhance the habitat of that land, and just improve the condition of the resource. So this kicked off January of 2021. But the authority for it ends at the end of the Farm Bill, which is September 30th of 2023. So the incentives are still available, but it would need to be reported as complete by September 30th of 2023. So we're running out of time for FMI for now. I don't know what the next Farm Bill will bring. The conservation plan needs, yeah.
Hey, Anne has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think she just answered. Is it being considered in the next Farm Bill?
Unfortunately, I'm a minion, so I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure. It seems like every year in my limited experience, there's something for custom forestry. Before this was the tree thinning incentives. We didn't have any activity for that in Maryland, because at that time we weren't requiring management for riparian buffers. And the parameters for the tree thinning incentives were that you had to have done a management activity first before you would qualify. So no one qualified because we weren't making people do management on trees. So this is our first time in recent history that anything's ever actually suited us based on how we've operated. So I don't know if it'll be back or not, but
yeah,
hopefully.
we've had some thinnings. They just didn't go through that program. It doesn't mean that we weren't trying to get people into the program.
Oh yeah, I just mean we didn't use that funding.
Okay. And do we have a fact sheet on that I could distribute to staff?
Yeah, we sure do.
Thank you.
Let me write that down. Fact sheet for Ian. And Anne, for the forestry workshops, I'm not going to talk as fast about this part.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Kind of going back to what we were just saying, the one cool thing is that FMI can be used to assist producers with completing their one management activity. So if you have somebody who's due for management for a tree practice, they can use this and possibly have much better cost share. It's a big ask of FSA staff because they are just swimming in work. But at the same time, if they have the ability to adapt the 848A to change it from a normal, 10-year management activity to listing out the practice scenarios for FMI, there's a lot more money to be had there, and somebody can kind of go a little bit more above and beyond. They can't be paid for both management and FMI for the same activity, but they could do both, or they could do FMI instead of management. The payment rate is the lesser of the actual cost to complete the practice, or 75% of the practice scenario. So it pays decent.
You have,
All
you have
land.
a couple of things in the chat, Laura. I know you can't see that, but
No, I can't see them. If Julie, do you want to say anything?
Sorry, I figured we would do, if you don't mind, wait and go through the questions in the chat at the end of your presentation, if that's all right.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. Let me check my timing. Okay. All land currently enrolled in CRP with an eligible practice up until the last 2 years of the contract is eligible. If it's in the final, 2 years, it's not eligible. And there's still, this money is basically still available, but it would need to be reported as completed by the end of FY23. So we're just getting close to the end. And this is something that we've talked about a decent amount before, but maybe it's just been at time periods where people have just been swamped with other stuff. So I have training materials and fact sheets and things like that I can send out if people are interested. Just to talk about upcoming dates and deadlines. So this year they moved it earlier, and it's the national deadline. This is great for FSA, but it's going to have NRCS hustling a little bit more. The deadline for NRCS to complete status reviews and provide signed copies to FSA is July 6th this year. The final day for FSA to accept re-enrollment offers is July 31st. And then all conservation plans need to be approved by NRCS by September 8th. And then, of course, September 30th is always our final day for FSA to approve re-enrolling conservation plans and contracts, and no authority to approve any re-enrollments after this date exists. So there is no plan B there. Let's see. Oh, and this, just to clarify, we are always taking new offers for CREP. So when I'm talking about these deadlines, they are for re-enrollments. General CRP was just announced, and like I mentioned briefly, it kicks off on February 27th and runs until April 7th. And then grassland CRP will follow, and we don't have that information yet. FSA also doesn't have the notice or any of like the specific information for general CRP yet. We don't have the ranking fact sheet. All we have is the news release that went out to everyone at the same time as us. So I expect that information at any time, and FSA will then kind of gear up for the sign up from there. I hustled, but I guess we did better on time than I thought. But okay, were there questions, Julie?
Yeah, let's go through the chat. Let's see. I'm gonna go back up to the top. Okay. There is a question. If after a 15-year contract, the planting still does not appear to be as dense as it should be, if the property is re-enrolled, will FSA pay to overseed to increase the density?
Unfortunately not. We could, if it depends on whether it meets standards and specs. So no, we're not going to pay for it. We can't. There's no ability to. The only thing we could do would be to have the conservation plan reflect maybe an earlier management activity of overseeding. That's one option. Otherwise, it would need to be at the participant's expense, and the status review would need to reflect, does it meet standards and specs, or would it just be better if it were a denser stand.
All right. And just made a comment, I think it was in response to, some of the acres that have come out of out of CREP, that DNR has 11,360 acres in permanent CREP easements. So that's where some of that CREP may have gone.
Awesome.
Okay, the next question is from Teresa. She says, there used to be a cost share tracking form to use for cost share assistance documentation, where we jointly entered what the producer was receiving from each agency or partner for cost share assistance.
Mm-hmm.
That was when CREP first started in 1997, when FSA paid 50%, Max paid 37.5%, and DU is paying 7.5% to give them close to 100%. Maybe this type of form could be developed and used for tracking cost share funds.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen a few offices still kind of bringing that one back and adapting it for what works for them. And I think what I could do is create kind of a universal one, and then people could adapt it as they see fit, because everyone has their own preferences and things that keep them sane. But there's a lot of good tools floating around that I'm sure we could share. Let me make a note of that.
Ready? Andrew Zimmerman says, what is the time frame to complete needed maintenance for Clear 30, and what is the payment rate? For example, find something on a status review. How long do they have to correct it? Do we schedule the maintenance for the end of the next fiscal year, or do they get a few years to correct it? Also, is the maintenance cost the full NRCS rate or a percentage?
For Clear 30, let's see. There's payment scenarios. Clear 30 has a lot of information. Let me write down who asked this, because I can send him stuff. Andrew, you said Andrew Zimmerman?
Yep.
Okay, I'll send him some stuff direct. Right now, I think the only participation is in Carol and Caroline. But there's a big difference between, the conservation plan should list when maintenance should occur. But there's a difference between maintenance and compliance. So when we ask someone to do a maintenance activity, because say something like Clear 30, we haven't actually lived this yet. We're just saying we're going to do this because the contracts that are enrolled are only a year in. But I think NRCS would go out there and say, okay, this stand is really thinning out. I think it could use an overseeding or whatever they see with their technical expertise. And then they put it in the plan so FSA could do it. But I think it would just be a normal time frame. Okay, if you're telling them to do it because you spotted it in April of 2023, maybe you ask them to do it within the next year. And in terms of if they don't do it turning into compliance, well, that's just one more issue that I hadn't even thought about yet, and I don't want to deal with it. So I hope that people just do it, because one of the flaws with more options is more ways that can go wrong. For instance, with FSA, now that we are handling management so much more according to the federal rules, and we're actually having people do it, and we're notifying them in a timely manner. They're getting the letters, their conservation plans are solid. It makes the expectations very clear. The problem with us doing our side of it and making the expectations clear is that then when people don't do it, we're stuck with the accountability side, and we have to enforce the compliance side. So ultimately, if a conservation plan had maintenance listed in it for Clear 30 and people continued not to do it and it morphed into a compliance issue, then FSA would have to take it from there. But if it still met standards and specs, I don't think it would be an issue, but that's something we'll have to deal with when we get there. If somebody, it's going to be case specific, if that makes sense. The payment scenarios, there are dozens of them. And I think, let's see. I can send you a list of them if you want, Andrew. It's like 75%, I think. NRCS helped develop them. I'm struggling here, but I think it's 75% of the practice scenario, or 100% if they do it themselves. I forget, but it's something along those lines where basically the costs are darn near covered. Did that even remotely tell you what you wanted to know, Andrew?
And yes, thanks.
Okay. I'll send you some stuff.
All right. Dee just mentioned that they would love to have fact sheets. I assume that's Washington County Soil Conservation District.
Fact sheets on what
Travis.
did they say?
Oh, nope.
Okay.
Dee, if you want to specify what fact sheets you need, that would be great. And Travis has kind of a technical question here. Would goats be considered a treatment option for tree plantings? Flash grazing. I know that grazing is prohibited in CREP plantings. I guess that's something that we haven't, I don't think we've dealt with before, but might be something we could consider in the future. Laura, do you have any comment on that one?
Just that they've scaled back some of the limitations on haying and grazing CRP in general. The reductions are a little less daunting, and I think it's a little bit easier for people to do than before. It's not just the hard no that we had for a while. And I think, let me try to remember real quick, with our management, I want to say that it's not something we've considered what did we say? Manage harvest and hay. Might work for some practices, but I think, like you said, it would have to be technical, and in general, they can ask to hay or graze their property. Never mind, I'm thinking grass cover anyway. For trees, I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I think it's something we could consider, but I don't know if anybody's tried that yet. So we'll get back to you, Travis. I've made a note of it, and I think that's something that we could consider. All right. Let me see if there's any additional.
Julie, I have a question for Laura.
Yep.
Can we go back to the whole PIP thing? So I don't know how recent of a decision that is, and if I missed something that came out that clarified the whole cost share and not over 100%, I apologize, but if I'm understanding you correctly, right, now that Max would pretty much be at the other 50% and we're at 100 for everything we're doing, you're saying, right, that they shouldn't be getting a PIP that gets them over 100%.
No, they can't. That's where PIP is frustrating for CREP. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a lot to consider. And I stared at it for an immense amount of time before I, responded to questions about it, trying to make sure I fully understood it. But for CREP PIP, they can go above 100%. But the catch is that when we're paying the bonus, the 40%, when we're calculating what we can multiply by 40%, we have to subtract the max cost share. So if they get 50% max cost share and they get 50% FSA cost share, they can still receive PIP if it takes them above the 100%, but we just can't pay them 40% of what they're getting paid by max. We can only pay 40% of what FSA is paying them. So
Gotcha.
if they go above the 100, that's okay.
Yeah, okay, good. I was making sure. I mean, were people actually paying the bonus on the max stuff?
I have suspicions that probably
you don't have
just
to answer
because
that. Yeah, you don't have to.
it's one of those things where it's like, okay, let's just keep going. Because it's easy to misinterpret, but then when we look carefully at some of the examples, it's like, oh, okay. And then I made sure with the national office, because I'm not trying to short anybody, money if they're owed it, it's not my bank or it's not my money. I'm not trying to keep it from them, but I also just don't want to have to ask for it back.
Yep. No, we're good. I was just making sure, like when we advertise, hey, there's a potential of 140% here. I just wanted to make sure that was still accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say it's potential to go above 100, but maybe just not the 140% anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Thanks, Laura.
Mm-hmm.
And we did update the CREP technical reference to include a better description of how this all plays out. So if it's not clear in the CREP technical reference, please let us know, because we spent a lot of time trying to make it clear, but it is confusing. All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I think this is probably just a good chance for everybody to take a quick break. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and looks like it's 10:38 now. So we will come back at 10:43 and get started with the next presentation. All right. Hopefully everybody got a chance to take a little break, and we're going to get started again here. I am going to give a presentation kind of from the NRCS side. So again, my name is Julie Devers, and I'm a state biologist with NRCS. And we kind of handle the technical side of things while FSA administers the program. And we get a lot of help. It's great partnership with MDA, Maryland DNR, and the soil conservation districts. So if I say NRCS, I mean kind of that whole group of partners. I'm going to turn off my camera so I can look at my other screen. All right. Get this to advance. Okay. So just a reminder, Laura has mentioned the CREP technical reference, and it is in the FOTG in section 1H. I'm just showing the table of contents here that there's lots of information about the different conservation practices and some information about approved cover that might differ from the Maryland Conservation Planting Guide. And then there's several appendices in the CREP technical reference as well. For the most part, it covers CREP CREP, but there is some information about CRP as well. And as Laura said, there's also these guide summary sheets for both CREP and CRP in the FOTG, and they're very helpful for just quickly looking at what the different incentive payments are and cost share and things like that. We do try to keep this all as up to date as possible. The last update we did was in November of 2022. If you notice something that is not up to date and you either have a question about it or you have a suggestion on how to update it, please let us know. It's a pretty long guide, so there are things that might have fallen through the cracks. Okay, so for this presentation, my objectives are to go over the planning process, the checklist for the conservation plan, and then I have some information at the end, just kind of updates and reminders. So just a reminder, and most of you all are seasoned planners, but just a reminder of the 9-step planning process, and that it is an iterative process that for the most part we try to kind of follow it in order, but sometimes we go back and forth between the steps and the phases. So I'm going to talk about the first 7 steps, which are kind of laid out nicely in the FOTG section 1F. There is a suitability and feasibility determination worksheet instructions, and within that it lays out how the 7 steps are related to the feasibility and suitability worksheets and kind of the CRP process. So you can always reference that if kind of want to go through some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So this first step of planning, whether for a new CRP or CREP enrollment, whether you're doing a farm plan update or a new farm plan, or if FSA has sent someone over to you that is just interested in CREP, the first step is to identify problems. So sometimes the problems might be very obvious. You might go out and see that there is no buffer at all between the crops and a ditch or a stream. You might go out and see that there's no buffer and the cows are in a stream, and it might be kind of obvious what the opportunities with CREP are. Other times you might go out and see that there's already trees along the stream, and so it looks pretty good. but when you go to look at the map, you're measuring from the top of bank to the cropland, it might only be 15 feet. So, this is kind of the time to start identifying what the problems are and what some opportunities are. Next step is to determine the objectives of the client. So you're trying to figure out what their priorities are during this step. So are they interested in taking land that's producing poorly out of production? They might be interested in water quality. So you can start, like, as they're talking about what their priorities are and what their objectives are, start thinking about what conservation practices might be opportunities for them. They might be just really interested in wildlife. So you might be thinking CPD4D wildlife buffer. They might be interested in expanded buffers up to 250 feet if they are eligible. They might be really interested in creating more habitat for waterfowl, especially if they have a lot of wet areas on their property that are not producing very well. They might be interested in a shallow water area or a wetland restoration. If they are really into grassland birds, they might be interested in, and they have like a big contiguous block, they might be interested in doing, taking a whole field out for grassland birds. Or they might be interested in forested buffers. As Laura said, there's lots of financial incentives right now for forested buffers. So that is a great opportunity. Also in this step, you want to be starting to think about what kind of equipment they have and what kind of maintenance and management they are willing to do, and make sure that it's clear that there will be maintenance and management. Once you've helped them develop some objectives, think about those objectives, and you have some ideas of what conservation practices they might be interested in, that's a good time to go out and do an in-person field visit. So inventory resources is the next step. And this is a good time to take one of those suitability and feasibility worksheets from the FOTG section 1H out to the field and start identifying whether the site is has the feasibility and suitability to be part of a certain practice. So during this phase, it's really important to document everything that you're seeing, and FSA especially wants you to document all of the water bodies. And this is also a good time to look at the required resource concerns, because you'll need to do a CART assessment. And also it's a good time to start thinking about how you're going to fill out the CPA 52 while you're out doing this field visit. Okay, once you've filled out most of the suitability and feasibility worksheet, you can start analyzing some of the data and determining whether the practice is feasible and suitable, and then documenting it on this worksheet. So this is a communication tool between NRCS and FSA. So you want to make sure that you're as clear as possible on this worksheet so that they know what you've looked at and what your findings are. If you find that the practice that you thought might be a good fit is not a good fit, you might want to do another worksheet for a different practice. This is where you're starting to think about alternatives if it's not a good fit. Okay, and then you're moving on to the second phase, which is the decision support. So this is where you can start communicating some of those alternatives that you've come up with. So, you know, obvious alternative is to do nothing. Or if you have thought through a couple of different practices, or a couple of different ways that they might be able to implement practices. Those are the alternatives that you can present to the client. And you can show them some maps, ask if they're okay with taking the land out of production that you have identified. And then it's also a good time to ask them, you know, would they be interested in taking more land out of production if they want to do an expanded buffer or something like that. So it's just good communication, time to do communication with them about what all of the options are. And then once you kind of talk all of this through, it's time for them to make a decision. And that is pretty much your first 7 steps. And that all needs to get communicated then to FSA. So Katie Starr was nice enough to give me a couple of examples of some projects that she was involved with recently. So for the first example, the objective of the landowner was to provide as much wildlife habitat as possible. So this person decided to go into CRP, and the plan includes on the outer edges here, habitat buffers for upland birds, CP33. They also have a pollinator habitat in the middle of the field and a prairie strip, CP43. And so Katie said that there weren't any ditches or streams on the property. So that's how they selected these practices. And let's see, I have another example that Katie supplied to me. And the objective of this landowner was that they were just interested in whatever CREP they were eligible for. So Katie took a look at what hydric soils they had and where the streams were on the property, and then showed them, you know, what it would look like to put, you know, the 35-foot buffers on ditches and intermittent streams, or 100-foot buffers on perennial streams or wetland areas. And they decided to enroll it all. So they pretty much put all of the maximum buffers that they could on each of the ditches, intermittent streams, or and perennial or wetlands. So anyway, those are a couple of examples that I appreciate Katie giving to me so I could show to you. All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit to just talk about the CPA 52. All right, so a little background on why we do the CPA 52. It is how we comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. So, which is NEPA, and it says that federal agencies must consider all potential environmental impacts of their proposed actions by analyzing impacts during their decision-making processes and considering reasonable alternatives to those activities before implementing activities that have the potential to significantly impact the human environment. Okay, so in order to assess all of those potential environmental impacts, we consult with other agencies who have experts. And so we can consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Maryland Department of Natural Resources on federally and state listed threatened and endangered species. We can consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer, who is located at the Maryland Historic Trust when we have cultural resources on a property. And there's opportunities to consult with others as well. If you have essential fish habitat on a property, you can consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service or migratory birds. If you have a concern, consult with Fish and Wildlife Service, and there are other people that we can consult with if we need to. So there's 3 levels of the NEPA analysis. And so we typically are able to stay within the categorical exclusion, which is kind of the most straightforward method. And so this one is where we try to avoid adverse impacts so that we can use a categorical exclusion. If there is no way to avoid adverse impacts and we really want to move forward with a project, we can do an environmental assessment, which is quite a bit more paperwork and takes quite a bit more time. We can do that at the state office level. And then for big programs or big projects, it might be necessary to do an environmental impact statement. This is really rare for us at the state level to do, and this is something that is completed at the national level. So like I said, try to stay here in the categorical exclusion level. Okay, so you may be thinking, well, I'm doing conservation practices, so how could I be doing anything bad to the environment? But any of the conservation practices could potentially have an effect on cultural resources or endangered species or other environmental concerns. So in order to fully think through all of that, we have to go through the entire CPA 52, and it's not something that is designed to be difficult. It's actually designed to help you think through all of the different resource concerns and environmental impacts that you might have. And so this is something that is kind of unique to USDA, NRCS, and we are kind of lucky to be able to use it. There are other agencies and certainly other organizations that have to go through an environmental assessment for every project. And we certainly do not want to have to do that. So the more we take the CPA 52 seriously and fill it out appropriately, the more likely we are to be able to continue to use that. Okay, so we do have a memorandum of agreement between NRCS and FSA that states that NRCS will complete the CPA 52 and up to a certain point, and I'll describe that in a minute. So the top of the form is just kind of the background information. Like a lot of the forms that we use for this program, this is a communication tool between NRCS and FSA. So for other NRCS programs, I hope you would fill this out completely, but it's not just for your own use or your own office's use. It's also something that FSA has to sign. And so you want to make sure you're as thorough as possible in describing the client's objectives, the need for action, and then the alternatives. For the resource concerns, you need to make sure that you have a response for each of them, and then put information in about what no action, and then the different alternatives. As kind of, here's an example that shows how to fill that out. Moving on to the next section is special environmental concerns. For each of the environmental concerns, you need to put either present or not present. And so for this example, present that there's a state listed species for endangered and threatened species. And you can determine that by going to Conservation Desktop and looking at the Maryland DNR sensitive species layer. And if you get this green color, a state listed species, then you would respond present here. and then go through and document how you've consulted with either with Maryland DNR in this case, since it's a state listed species. So for all practices right now, we have to consult with Maryland DNR, send in the sensitive species project review worksheet, and make sure that that letter, as well as any response that you received, is attached to the CPA 52. Like I said, we're really trying to communicate with FSA that we have done the due diligence, and by including all of the attachments, they won't have to come back and ask you for it. Okay, this is the section that we complete up to, section O, and then FSA does the rest of it. So they do section P, Q, and R. This is just another reminder to include all the documentation. Okay. One note is that prescribed burning can fall under a categorical exclusion, but FSA is required to complete some additional environmental review. So if that is something that a producer is planning, need to contact FSA in advance so that they can do that additional environmental review.
Hey, and along those lines, just to chime in for the prescribed burn, what we really need to know more than anything is if the management practice changes from something that would fall as like listed per se to a prescribed burn later, then we really need to think about it. But if we know that if you know that the producer is going to do a prescribed burn and is adamant that, hey, I'll find that burn boss, this is for me, I'm going to do it, then we just want to have that considered initially in the 52 and to show that it was considered when the plan was done initially, and that might save FSA a lot of time down the road versus having to do a full-blown 850 for it. We might be able to utilize the 52 if we know that NRC has considered it. So just mentioning that if you know ahead of time, it'll help a lot.
Thanks for the clarification. All right, so now I'm just going to transition to the conservation plan. We have a checklist that we can use. And so an approved conservation plan is required before a CRP1 can be approved. So the plan can include just CRP, or it can be part of an overall conservation plan. And all CRP that's on a tract should be on one conservation plan. So if you have several contracts that are expiring and you're writing, updating the conservation plan, you don't need to do one for each contract. You should include them into one conservation plan. And then the conservation plan that I'm going to go over and associated documents must be submitted to FSA. All right, so you can use the conservation desktop CD to put together a conservation plan. And because of the changes in how CD does the conservation plan, there's not a lot of flexibility in where you can, different locations throughout the conservation plan that you can add information. So we have kind of decided for CREP that the best way to communicate information is to put it into the objective section. So it should be really clear in that objective section why and how the conservation is being put in place. And then there's some additional information that we'd like you to include in this section, like that the CREP cover, once established, should not be disturbed during primary nesting season, and that there's prohibition on harvesting and grazing. And this will also be in the conservation plan attachment, but we feel that it's good to put that right up front for people. And so in the checklist for CREP conservation plans, which can be found in the FOTG, we do have a little bit of example language that you can put into that objective statement. All right, so I'm just going to run through the checklist, and there's a lot of information on the checklist, so I'm not going to hit all of it, but the first thing is the conservation plan, kind of the big part of things, and it's also considered the record of decision. So this needs to be given to FSA in its printed format. And so for the conservation plan, you need to include all the practices per both establishment and management. And as you guys all know now, that the standard narratives cannot be changed. So just make sure that you select the correct narrative. So if you're doing conservation plan for re-enrollment, make sure to choose the CRP re-enrollment narrative. And then for CREP, CREP, since it is meant for both water quality and wildlife, make sure to select the narrative that mentions wildlife. There is information in the CD CART guide that can be found on the Maryland SharePoint site that goes over CREP, CRP, and CREP planning in CD and CART. Okay, next step is the conservation plan attachment. So this can be found in the FOTG and section 1H, it's number 11. And it's a 2-pager, and it has a ton of information for the participant. So this is really important that you give to them, and it might even be good to kind of talk through a lot of this with a highlighter, highlight the important sections. So it has the required activities, restricted activities, the prohibited activities, and then it talks about the management of the cover. The second page just has more information about the management of cover, and it also includes, because we are a federal agency, definitions and abbreviations. We have a lot of acronyms, so this helps people navigate some of those acronyms. Okay, the third thing is the IR sheets for each practice. Like I said, you should include IR sheets for both the establishment of the practice and for the management. And this is where some of the specific information can be added. So in the IR sheet, you need to make sure that you include any specifications like application rates for lime, fertilizer, any planned dates by which things should get done, any maintenance that is required. Again, this is something it would be great to go through with the participant and make sure they understand all of this. And this is also where you want to make sure that any tree planting plans, prescribed grazing management plans, or forest management recommendations are included. Next up is an engineering design. This is only if needed for practices like shallow water areas and wetland restoration. Then the conservation plan map, which is part of the conservation plan, but it's kind of just separately described here since there's some specifications. So the things that should be included are the field numbers and field boundaries, any easements there are on the property, and all of this kind of as just identified by FSA so that they are able to make it jive with their system. And then descriptions of what, whether they're going into CRP or CREP and which conservation practices. And then it's really helpful if you can put the buffer widths and clearly label them on there. this is all good not only for present day communication, but in 10 to 15 years when you're doing the status review and the re-enrollment. It's really great to have very clear information about how wide the buffer is supposed to be. Next up is the CPA 52, which I already went over. And then next is a breakdown of the acres. So FSA is responsible for coming up with the practice cost estimate. And it's important that we are very clear, NRCS is very clear with what acres are offered to the hundredths. And so not only need to know the number of acres in each practice, but also which components. So for example, they need to know which, how many acres are going to be tree and shrub planting, or how many acres are going to be berm, and how many acres are going to be in the ponded area. The more detail you can provide at this point, the more accurate FSA can be in creating their cost share agreement. Okay, the next step is to review. So as a planner, you want to take a good look at everything that you've put together. So you've done a lot of work at this point, and you want to look through it and make sure that everything makes sense. Hopefully by this time you've thought it through pretty well, but you know, sometimes you get to the end and you want to make sure that you have everything and it all makes not only sense to you, but will make sense to the FSA and the participant. Have all the things that you planned, do they meet the objectives of the client? Are the timelines to complete work clear? Especially anything that's kind of out in the future, like overseeding and spraying for invasive species. And will the plan make sense to the client in 10 or 15 years? And then the next step is just to get signatures. Oh, and we already went over the suitability and feasibility worksheets. Those need to be filled out for new enrollments, and those need to be included in what is given to FSA. Then the final step here is to review the plan with the participant. So provide copies to the participant. Like I said, you might want to go through and highlight anything that's might get missed if it's kind of not talked about and gone over. And then note in the Con6 notes when you provided the plan to the participant, and just kind of make sure that your Con6 notes are all up to date. All right, so just a quick review of the things that are in that conservation plan checklist. Conservation plan, or better known as the record of decision, conservation plan attachment, the IR sheets, the engineering design if needed, conservation plan map, the CPA 52, the acreage for each CREP practice for the cost estimate, and the suitability and feasibility worksheets. This is kind of all of the things that are on the checklist, but if there's additional items needed, you can certainly include those as well. Okay, a couple of final notes. Kind of already said this several times, but just remember that this is all a communication tool, and that FSA can only hold the producer accountable for the things that are in the plan. So if you're thinking it, but you haven't written it down, make sure you find a good place to make sure it's documented. And FSA can only pay for things that are in the plan. So you certainly don't want the producer to get to a point where they think that something is going to be paid for because you talked about it, but it wasn't actually in the plan. So for example, be sure to list the types of grasses on the plan, because no one will probably remember in 10 years, and that might determine what, if any, management is needed. Kind of the take home here is that the client risks payment reductions or termination, which could result in refunding payments they have received if the information is missing from the plan. Okay, so I have a few other topics to go over here. There's a couple of notes for grass buffers. So CP 22, the grass buffers that are included in CP 22, CP 9, or CP 23. If a CP 22 has a grass buffer incorporated into it, make sure that you note the location and the width and as much information as you can, so it's clear to both the client and to FSA. Also, if the CP9 or CP23, so the shallow water areas or wetland restoration, has a grass buffer, make sure that you note the location of that and the size. If the grass buffers are not included in the plan, when it's time for re-enrollment, the status reviews will be really difficult. For forestry plans, so I talked about this last year, but I just want to kind of remind people that a licensed forester is not required to sign off on planting plans for a new CP 22. But an IR sheet can be filled out, and anyone who has appropriate job approval authority can fill that out. So if a Maryland DNR forester is available and can work with you on it, that would be great. But if they are not available and there is someone else with job approval authority, they can fill out and sign off on the planting plans. On the other hand, licensed forester is required to sign off on a forest management IR sheet. So this is usually applicable at the re-enrollment for CP22 if forest management is needed. So just kind of to reiterate, at the beginning of the CP22, you don't have to have a licensed forester, but at the re-enrollment, if there's management needed, you do need to have a forester sign off on it. So just a reminder on buffers, that the buffers have to be immediately adjacent to the stream and parallel to the stream. And there can be no travel lanes between the water body and the buffer. So in this example below, if there's eligibility for a 100-foot buffer strip, but the first 15 feet already is forested, or there's already sufficient cover in some way, it can't be enrolled in CREP, but it has to be maintained as a buffer and can't be used as a travel lane. So even though they're not getting paid for that section, they can't just do whatever they want in that first 15 feet. So all of it, the whole, the section adjacent to the stream as well as the CREP buffer has to be maintained as a buffer. Okay, for marginal pasture land eligibility, if existing vegetation is already functioning as a buffer as determined by NRCS, the land is not eligible to be enrolled in CRP. If NRCS determines that existing vegetation is not functioning as a buffer, the conservation plan must identify a resource concern and require some action by the producer. So for example, if livestock is present in a wooded area and there's no understory, cattle exclusion and additional vegetation must be planted to establish a functioning riparian buffer. And so it can be enrolled in CP22. Okay, and some final notes. In a couple of minutes, we are going to transition over to the next presentation that Laura is going to do on status reviews and re-enrollments, but kind of just some technical notes that I wanted to say is that are here. So I'm going to start with when you need to go out and do a status review or a re-enrollment, make sure you're consulting with the participant about any issues or concerns that they have. They might have things that you don't notice or that they've kind of run into, and you really want to make sure that's all out in the light before they get to re-enrollment. You also want to describe very clearly to communicate with FSA on the status review why overseating or reestablishment is needed, and make sure that what you say in the status review is also reflected in the plan and vice versa, so that the plan and the status review match up. Also, if you are saying something verbally to the participant, you want to make sure that that is reflected in the status review and plan. So just kind of want to make sure that we're not saying something to the participant that FSA doesn't know about. This is the status review and the plan are opportunities to communicate between NRCS and FSA. We want to make sure that we're not kind of just talking directly to the participant without communicating that to FSA. And the conservation plan for enrollment must note any issues that need to be addressed. So, for example, any treatment of noxious or invasive species that are needed, or like I said, any overseeding or reestablishment. If NRCS expects a producer to do something, it just has to be in the plan, and then FSA can enforce it. All right, I think that is it for me. I just wanted to remind you all that as a fish biologist for many years, these buffers are really important, and they really do make a big difference for the species that I am most interested in, fish and freshwater mussels and anadromous fish habitat. And so I just want to thank you all for doing a good job of implementing the CRP and CREP programs. With that, are there any questions that came up in the chat?
There's a little bit in the chat. Do you have two screens or do you want me to relay to you?
Yeah, if you could relay it, that would be great.
Okay, let's see here. Let's see. Initially, there was a comment from Anne, which is something we've kind of been talking about recently, tied to other things, and that is the planning stage looks like a good place to be looking at the interaction of concentrated flows and the potential buffer design. Critical area planting might have a lot of potential in conjunction with riparian forest buffers, which makes sense because I think that's one of the things we've been saying is that when we are doing a new installation, we don't want to just have, you know, a blanket design. We can consider the specifics of that site and those needs early on before it's an issue later and we can't pay for it. If we see those concerns at the beginning, that's when we can pay for it. We could do a critical area planting and things like that. So Julie, I'll allow you to comment too.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have been kind of talking about that quite a bit lately, that it's really important that the planners kind of identify all the resource concerns. It's kind of easy to go out and think, all right, this person wants a CREP buffer and just start measuring things out. But walking the property and identifying any resource concerns is really important at that initial stage.
Let's see. And then Anne asked the question that Katie addressed directly, and then just mentioned that with DNR, they're working on agroforestry options that may be an asset for soil health goals and might be a fit for these smaller areas if it fits with landowner goals. Anne had asked about some of the remaining areas around the CP 42, 43, and 33 designs that Katie had on that farm. Anne was just inquiring about, what are the options for the remaining areas. And then lastly, Charlene wanted to know for CP23s, the wetland restorations, the buffer is usually in and around the pool areas. So is the acreage amount on those buffers adequate versus an average buffer width?
Let me see. Yeah, I mean, whatever is included in the design is fine. I'm not sure if I understand the question. Charlene, do you want to speak up and say your question?
On all the
Oh, go ahead.
CP 21s, all that, we have an average buffer width, 35 or however many it is. But when we're doing a wetland restoration or creation design, that buffer actually, there's no standard width to it. It's around the pool areas and inside, and it's just all over the place. So there's no average width to it. And the training was saying, we needed to provide FSA with that average buffer width. Well, on a wetland design, there's no average width. It's just the acreage of what we consider buffer versus pool.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Oh, and hey, Steve commented that the minimum width on a wetland is 35 feet.
Yeah, so when you're documenting that and conveying it to FSA though, just if it can, I see what you're saying, that it's hard to say if it's, greater than 35 feet. It's hard to say what the average is. So just need to convey, I guess, on the map exactly where it is. I think the comment that Laura, I think that was a comment that you had, that you need to just communicate with FSA where the buffer is, and if you can put an average width on it, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, if we know the acres, that's the biggest part, Charlene, because then we know for, management, okay, if they're doing an overseeding, how much do we pay them on, that kind of thing. But if it's, an average width, that's okay. So if I understand that it's going to be around the pool area and it's going to be an average, basically the more you can give us, the better. We'll see that it's a varying width based on, your design and the polygon, if you will, on the map. But if you can just say it's the width in a couple spots and tell us the acres, I feel like that's more than enough. Enough that everybody knows the rough expectation out there. When this isn't super fresh on our mind or we don't have you there, it's that great resource to ask all the time.
Right. And then we'll also have that polygon basically of that area on the design. So, okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. I don't see any other questions in the chat right now, so I am going to hand it over to Laura.
All right, good deal. Let's see here. All right, do you see my first slide, Julie?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay, the next and last thing I'm going to talk about today are status reviews and some of the considerations for re-enrollment. Again, I have about a half hour left, so I could trap you for a day probably talking about these things, but we'll do a half hour's worth. And status reviews are something that, given the opportunity to talk to technical staff, I will talk about every time because it's so important for so many reasons, and I really just can't convey it enough. So I will talk about some of the different status reviews that we need at FSA to have the function or have the program function, and then some of the things we need to see on those status reviews to be able to administer the program. Overall, status reviews are on-site evaluations of contracted CRP acres, which provide FSA with information that helps us determine contract compliance. So what we need them to do is extensively describe the conservation practices condition and whether it meets practice requirements. So does it meet standards and specs? We don't want you to say if the contract is compliant, because that's FSA's job. So we want NRCS. And again, I didn't do my usual warning on this, but I realized that I just wanted to say that when I say NRCS, I mean the same thing as Julie. I mean the MDA staff, I mean the soil conservation staff, all the people who are working on this program, but ultimately our MOA is with NRCS. And so it's just easier to say NRCS. So NRCS will document what they see, and then FSA determines compliance. So we want your technical expertise, and we want you to write down what you see, but FSA will make that determination of whether or not it's compliant based on the feedback you provide. There are 4 types of status reviews if we attempt to summarize them all. So the first one is when NRCS or the Forest Service with DNR will complete a field visit to verify that all the practices on the contract were installed according to NRCS standard and specs. So this one is documented on the 848B. That's the performance report I mentioned for cost share, where the producer comes in and says, hey, I did it. I finished installing it. And then we need the technical side of the office to go out and certify on the 848B. Yes, they did it and it meets standards and specs, looks good. And we only need the formal LTP 13 if the practice cannot be certified. And in that case, we want all the feedback we can get. Where you tell us why it doesn't meet standards and specs. We'll want photos, all that good stuff. The practice completion has to be timely. Typically, they have 1 year after the contract is approved, and an extension can be requested, but only 2 extensions can be granted in total. If multiple extensions have been requested, the original installation plan may now be ineffective. So in that case, if someone is coming up, they've had 2 extensions, and, conditions have changed, something has happened in that field since then. So the conservation plan may be, ineffective at this point, and they may need a different plan of action to install the practice successfully. They might need to do another burn down, or they might need to plant it with a different piece of equipment. And that's when we may ask you to revisit that conservation plan. NRCS is only required to certify performance after all the practices scheduled for the contract have been installed. When we say CRP1, that is our formal contract form number. Okay, let's see here. Ooh, she got stuck. Okay. The next is what I call the full establishment status review. You can call it what you want, but it's essentially when NRCS or DNR goes back out no more than 2 years after certification to report that all the practices have been successfully established and that they are properly functioning. This needs to be documented on the NRCS LTP 13. This is something that FSA will ask you for, because we have the lovely task of trying to keep track of things like this. And so we will probably, send you a request to go out and visit. And it's not because we're looking to give you work to do. It's because it's required. And we want to go back out after, 24 months and make sure that the practice is actually up and running, not just planted. And at that time, if the practice has failed and it's, due to a natural disaster or no fault of the participant, then we can offer them reestablishment cost share. And that's one of the reasons it's important to get back out there early, is that if we catch the failure early on, we actually have, cost share that we're able to pay for it. But if we don't see it and we miss that window of time, it's gone. Another type would be reviews for management. And in this case, NRCS or DNR will conduct a site visit to certify completion of management activities after the participant has told FSA that the activity has been completed. Again, we'll use the 848B for this one. We don't need the LTP 13 unless there's an issue. And when we ask you for this one, we're asking you to go out and certify on the performance report that they did the management activity that they said they did. Overseeding or interseeding management activities can be certified using receipts and without a site visit. That's something we kind of met in the middle on for the sake of workload. So even if cost share is not provided, we want that 848B. And if it's just overseeding or interseeding, that's where it would likely be the district conservationist who's looking at it and saying, okay, that was the right seeding amount. The day they did it was logical. All right, this fits the bill. This should be fine. The other one, which we talk about the most, would be status reviews for re-enrollments. And this is when NRCS or DNR goes out for an on-site visit to document what they see and the status, if you will, of the practice. It can be completed as early as 2 years before the contract expires. More often than not, it's done in the final year, but it can be done earlier. And this status review also serves as a site visit for re-enrollment. So whether or not the producer is going to re-enroll or not, this can count. So we don't have to know if they're going to before you go out. So if you're going out, say a producer has multiple contracts, which a lot of them do, and they have some expiring this year and some expiring next year, you can knock out next year's status reviews now if you're feeling spunky and you look ahead in the conservation plan and you see, oh, okay, that other buffer is expiring next year. Let me look now. And certainly the perk of that is if you identify any issues with the cover, it gives them that much more lead time to go ahead and, do whatever maintenance they need to do and catch up so that they could, increase their chances of being eligible for re-enrollment. One thing to consider, we don't always know if someone will re-enroll, but while you're already there, it's good to think ahead and identify their options for management should they re-enroll. And this form or this one can be documented on the Maryland specific re-enrollment status review form. The most current version is April 2021. And I believe if someone wants to use the LTP 13, that's fine too. I think we agreed that that was fine. Either one is okay. But the content of what you put on the form is what's so important. We need a lot of feedback on that form to make it worth our time. And we'll talk a lot more about the re-enrollment ones. So site visits can be requested by a participant prior to implementing a management activity to obtain technical assistance with the implementation. A lot of people, when they're told that, okay, it's time for your management, they're like, can someone come out and help me? What do I need to do? And if they ask for this, then these site visits only need to be documented in the case file using the conservation assistant notes, and FSA should receive a copy of the notes. For succession and interests, when the contract is basically changing hands because either a producer has passed away or the land has sold, we will only utilize these site visits if the participant asks. So we aren't going to just directly send you a request for a status review every time we're processing a succession and interest. The CRP practice maintenance and compliance are the responsibility of the participant and any contract successors. So any or all the parties that are on the contract would need to contact NRCS directly for technical assistance. If they and we need to keep the Privacy Act in mind. So basically, if somebody wants to know the status of cover that or of cover that they're about to buy, that's okay, but we're not going to be the ones to request that every single time. And the other thing is that we have to be really mindful of it. So we can't just have a buyer for a piece of property come in and want to have information that they're not privy to yet. So if you're in that situation, we'll talk about it in more detail, but we have to be really mindful of what information we give out and work with the seller to make sure that they are okay with us providing that information. Okay, signatures on status reviews. NRCS needs to obtain the signatures on the status reviews and provide a copy. And to us, what this does is confirm that the results have been discussed and provided to the participant. And again, we're not asking you to tell them if they're compliant or not. That's not your problem. That's ours. It's our responsibility. We just want you to go out and say, hey, this is what I found. This is what I saw. It looks like it should meet standards, and FSA will be in touch later. And, you can chat with them about whatever you want, but please just don't veer into compliance. And please don't give them advice of what, especially at the time of re-enrollment, please don't give them technical advice and have them start spending money on the property. We've had situations where people go out for re-enrollment status reviews and they say, oh, this isn't going to meet. You should start doing, this, this, and this. But then FSA hasn't been involved yet. And it turns out, they have an easement and they're not even eligible for re-enrollment. So then they've ordered a bunch of trees for cover that we can't even re-enroll. So there's always a lot to it. So just please be mindful with advice you provide at the time of re-enrollment and make sure FSA stays heavily involved. Technical assistance will be made available as necessary as a follow-up to the status review. And if you give the technical advice to the producer or guidance, it should be documented on the form so there's a formal record of it. And the verbal conversations in the field need to match what's provided on the form. Essentially, please don't try to be their friend and tell them one thing and then tell us another, because it just makes it a big mess. And I don't think anyone really benefits from it. Let's see. before you go out, we need to provide you certain information. FSA needs to give you an aerial map showing where the, if it's already enrolled in CRP, we'll give you an FSA map. If it's something, I don't know, we'll always make sure we give you an image and tell you where the fields are, what the practices are. And then if it's something where we've had spot checks done before, or there is documented non-compliance, we should give you that history so you can kind of have a better idea of what you're looking at and gauge progress and things like that. When there are issues found out in the field and a practice doesn't meet standards and specs, we definitely want to know about it. Photos are really important when there are problems. If there's not issues, the photos aren't required, but we will never turn them down because it gives us that snapshot in time of what the cover was like that day, and it is immensely helpful to have. We want to know the type and location of the qualifying water bodies. We want to know the location of any issues, and that should be marked on the map. So, if you see Phragmite out there, please circle and show us where you see it. We want to know roughly how much, we want to know percentages, the location, all that information. If the buffer is not the required width, or the location of the practice doesn't match what's on the conservation plan or the FSA map, please document that and show on the map where the buffer is too short. If it's supposed to be 100 feet and it's only 70, we need to know that, and we need to know where it's, deficient. Please make sure that you document any problems by stating how the enrolled acres doesn't meet standards. You can't just say it doesn't meet standards. We need to know why. Please make sure that you reference, the exact problem and what action would need to be taken to address it so that we know, because you are the technical expert. And then on top of that, if anything is a recommendation versus definitely needed, please make that clear. So if there's things they could do to improve the sand and make better habitat, protect water quality even better, that's great. But we need to know what is necessary versus what is going above and beyond or just a recommendation. Excuse me. Let's see. The practice needs to be immediately adjacent to the water qualifier for CP 21 and 22. If it's not, please make sure that you document. This is kind of what Julie already talked about, but if it's not, please make sure you document in the area, if the area in between is being maintained as if it's in CRP or in a natural state. FSA will need to determine if it was enrolled correctly the first time in terms of the widths, if it isn't immediately adjacent to the water qualifier, if there is an area between the buffer under contract and the actual water body, then the plan needs to address that area and must be maintained as CRP. So really, it's exactly what Julie said, but just to expand on that, the conservation plan needs to reflect, say we go back to Julie's example where I think there was, the water body and then 15 feet wasn't eligible and then there's 85 feet. We need the conservation plan to say that it's a 100-foot buffer, but just explain that only 85 feet is under contract, but it's a 100-foot buffer. So when we go out there, we want to see a 100-foot buffer. The whole field review process that we'll talk about in a minute is FSA's responsibility, but FSA needs to know on the status review map if a CRP field that is completely enrolled in CRP is a whole field, because we can't always tell from the old conservation plan or the old imagery. And this is where the scrap map comes into play, and it's super handy. So if when you're out there and you're labeling everything as, okay, here's the ditch here, here's wet woods here. We want to know that, because even if the buffer you're looking at is on one side of the field, or if it qualified off of one side, but there's a ditch on the other, we want to know about the ditch on the other side, because it really is crucial when it comes to the whole field review. And most offices will absolutely want a copy of your scrap map. And the gist of it is that we really want every bit of information we can receive. You're taking the time to go out in the field, you're walking the farm, you're doing the visit, you're using your technical expertise. And so what we ask is that everything you see out there, that you tell us about it and you convey as much to us as possible, because it's really helpful, and you are our eyes out there and you are the technical experts, and we just want to know what you see. So if you go out there and you take pictures, please let us have them, because it is really helpful. And we certainly benefit from it, especially with these CRP contracts where we keep having re-enrollment after re-enrollment after re-enrollment. We can expect to see, or there's a strong chance that these will come up for re-enrollment again. So it gives us that snapshot in time. In terms of timing, the earlier we receive the completed status review, the earlier we can request a conservation plan and make the re-enrollment season easier on everyone. Receiving the status review earlier makes it so we can contact the producer, inform them of any timelines for anything that needs to be corrected, and confirm that they do want to move forward and they do want to re-enroll. That means they can sign their 2C. and the CRP1. So then you can start working on the conservation plan, you know, confidently knowing that they're actually going to follow through versus wondering if you're doing it in vain. And the other thing is that while the deadline is earlier this year with July 6th, FSA it gets pretty hairy in those offices between July 1st and July 15th for FSA for crop reporting. So the earlier you can provide those status reviews, the better, because then that's when we can call the producer and say, hey, looks like you fell a little bit behind on this maintenance, but you know, if you do this real quick, you should be okay. You appear to be eligible or you're not eligible, then they can make those decisions, and it just gives everyone more time to function without running around like crazy. If everything's fine on this with the practice, then there isn't a lot of information that's really triggered to be put on the status review checklist, except for answering the questions via the checkbox. So again, like I kind of already rambled, just remember that your visit is that snapshot in time. So anything you give us could be helpful, even if it's like a note of what species were there, so we can see how it may have changed by the next time there's a site visit. And this is especially helpful for re-enrollment status reviews for grass practices that were planted to cool season grasses, but warm season grasses have taken over. So the practice still meets NRCS standards, and it would just need to be noted on the status review and in the new conservation plan. And it's crucial and a huge help for compliance to have that look at what it was like that day, so we have a better idea of when the problem started on the site. Excuse me. Like I said, we just need you to be our eyes and our ears. Not really our ears. That's kind of dumb. But we want to use your technical expertise to tell us if the cover meets standards and specs. And then from there, the Farm Service Agency, in conjunction with the county committee, will make the compliance determination. And please, if you send the status review to them via email or anything else, please make sure in any kind of cover letter that you don't mention compliance. Just remember that has to be FSA's call. Moving on to eligibility for enrollment overall or re-enrollment, FSA needs to review the person and land eligibility, and that's everything from, you know, looking at the adjusted gross income, reviewing for easements to see if the land is now already legally protected. So there's a lot of things we have to consider beyond that as well. But this is one of the reasons we want to make sure people don't put work into the cover at the time of re-enrollment before FSA has checked on the basic eligibility. And then we also have to consider stacked buffers and the whole field review. So we really just want everybody to look at the cover as early as possible, but then hang tight on any actions until we can kind of get ourselves involved there. Excuse me. Okay. When it comes time for re-enrollment, FSA is tasked with looking back at the policy that was in place at the time the contract was originally enrolled. So for CREP, land can continuously re-enroll if the cover satisfies the conservation practice criteria that applied at the time of original enrollment. FSA may ask for technical help to determine if a practice meets standards based on a certain point in time. And this is, like I said, why it's so important to have feedback on the locations of water bodies on status reviews. If you're interested in some of the history of CREP and how it's evolved, you know, when certain widths were permitted, then when it changed, or, you know, wider buffers were allowed based on certain criteria. The CREP Tech Guide does include a history of CREP if you're interested in some of the older policy. And this is the policy that FSA reviews to determine what policy was in place at the time of original enrollment. So it's our job to dig back, but the better we document, the more we stay sane. When we're documenting now at the time of re-enrollment, I just keep telling people, I'm sorry, I know this is a pain, but just think, if we're the ones reviewing this potential re-enrollment 10 or 15 years from now, how much are we going to thank ourselves that we actually took the time to write down how wide the buffer was or what the policy was when we made this decision? You know, we say we allowed a 300-foot buffer, and we actually took the time to write down why we allowed the 300-foot buffer. How much easier will our jobs be in the future? Or how much will people in the future not curse us? So hopefully this documentation will pay off for us, because with the way our CREP agreement is written now, unless that changes, we'll continually be basing re-enrollment eligibility based on the parameters that were in place at the time of original enrollment. Okay, so one of the things we found when we were looking at grass cover at the time of status reviews, when a contract is up for re-enrollment, is that different offices had different interpretations, different staff had different interpretations. Everyone looks at it through the lens of, their own opinions and interpretations of policy. We had a lot of producers having different experiences in different offices, sometimes even same producer in different counties. So what we wanted to do was try to come up with a more uniform approach to how we evaluated grass cover for status reviews, and what parameters the technical agency would use when deciding if grass cover met standards and specs. So this is what we came up with. It says 2018, but that's because so far I think it's worked for us, and it's basically a compilation of rules of thumb for evaluating grass cover, so producers have a consistent experience from year to year and across county lines. Excuse me. So just to quickly roll through some of them, one of the biggest ones that we seem to get hung up on is that the mix doesn't need to be exactly what was planted when the contract was enrolled. The original mix was intended to establish the cover with a minimum number of species necessary, but it's normal to see the composition change as, the grasses naturalize and other, grasses end up in the cover, and that's okay. So if the cover has other wildlife friendly and native grasses, that's okay. It just can't have noxious weeds or be comprised of invasive species. So if the original mix had 4 cool season grasses, but now it's not the same things, but what's out there is a great healthy cover, that's wonderful and that's fine. So it doesn't have to be the original 4. Stands that are dominated by tall fescue are not out of compliance, but they don't meet the standards for CREP. So the tall fescue wasn't a part of the original mix, but it's common for it to take over, especially in certain counties. So in that case, a replant will be necessary to have a variety of grasses and legumes. Unfortunately, we can't pay for it, but what we do in Maryland, our approach to it is to allow the participant to re-enroll and then require them to replant within a predetermined amount of time. This is set by the county committee, and I think it's usually a year. And then if necessary, NRCS may decide to recommend a different mix than what was originally specified, since the same mix could be ended, maybe smothered out again by the tall fescue. And then the other thing that NRCS said should help would be scheduling a light disking and overseeding as part of their management activity in their second contract to try to deter that same conversion to monoculture happening again. The next thing, rule of thumb, is that the stand doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to meet standards. So there's a difference between a maintenance issue and a compliance issue. And the difference is defined at the FSA side of the office. If they only have 2 species of grasses, but the clover and 1 other species from the original mix has been smothered out, it's not a compliance issue. If the stand has sufficient diversity as a result of other, wildlife friendly species introducing themselves, then the stand may not require additional seeding. But if the cover is just, 1 to 3 species, then FSA will allow them to re-enroll and give them a set amount of time to go ahead and overseed and, increase diversity within that first year, and then we can keep them in the program. If there's woody growth in the grass cover, there are things that we ask you to think about. And that's, how old are the trees? Are they there just because the producer missed the chance to spray last spring, maybe when it just rained nonstop? And are they just a year old? Or is it obvious that they've never mowed or sprayed since that contract started 10 years ago? If it's a small amount of woody growth and the land can still be farmed, then what we'll do is allow the participant to re-enroll and give them a predetermined date to remove the woody growth. Technical staff still need to make their assessments on the status review based on the 5% tree cover for the 1 acre rule, which is that it can't be higher than 5% per acre. But if it's new growth, we should be able to give the producer a chance to get it under control, and just remember that it has to be capable of being cropped. So in most cases, if the county committee takes what's on the status review and decides that they think it's a maintenance issue versus a compliance issue, if it's greater than 5%, the county committee can decide to go ahead and tell that person, hey, get that woody growth out. And then they may choose to give them time after the contract is re-enrolled to go ahead and reestablish any grass cover as needed. So compliance issues always have to be addressed before re-enrollment, and sometimes it may render someone ineligible for re-enrollment, and the county committee will make those decisions. But sometimes if it's just a little bit of woody growth and you can give us that feedback about how much and where, sometimes we're able to salvage that contract and allow that producer to catch up a little bit and, keep good cover in the program. Anytime a replant or reseeding or any major work is needed on the CRP cover, make sure, or NRCS should make sure that they refer participants back to FSA and not just tell them to do the work. Like we've said, probably nauseating amount, sorry. NRCS will provide the technical feedback and we will deliver the information to the producer in conjunction with that guidance from NRCS. One of the responsibilities of FSA is obviously compliance, and we therefore deal with the appeal. So it's really important for us to keep a strong administrative record. We document everything we tell the producer because it's crucial. So we need to know about it so we can deliver any guidance to them in print. Excuse me. You know, it wouldn't be a meeting if we didn't take the time to talk about stacked buffers. So I promise I'm getting towards the end here, but this has happened since our last big meeting, so I need to take a few minutes to talk about stacked buffers. Maryland has stacked CRP buffers. In the past, we basically allowed a producer to expand a buffer and created that additional width as a second buffer on paper, but as one buffer in the field. This is something that was done with basically quiet national concurrence, and we rocked and rolled with it, and it was fine, but now it's no longer fine, and the FSA National Office will no longer permit stacked buffers. And the process to combine or terminate these buffers began last year. So we did it last year, and this review is going to happen on an annual basis until all the stacked buffers have come up for re-enrollment. The bad news is we have to do this process. The good news is that we didn't have to do an overhaul of everything all at one time. And there are other benefits as well. I mean, once these are combined, they'll be combined and it'll be, you know, easier in the future. So it's not all bad news by any means, but from here on out, at the time of re-enrollment, all stacked buffers that are under different contracts have to be reviewed by state or county office staff in the final year of the contract. So basically when it's up for re-enrollment. The quick history is that basically prior to 2001, buffers that were enrolled in CREP were limited to a max of 120 feet for 21, CP21, and 180 feet for riparian buffers. But then in 2001, the 1997 version of the CREP agreement was amended and allowed up to a max of 300 feet. And then in 2009, the CREP agreement allowed a smaller max width of 250 feet where it stands now. But after 2001, at eligible locations, they started adding additional buffers alongside the previous 120 foot or 180 foot buffers, and they created the stacked buffer. So basically when policy allowed for a wider buffer, people said, ooh, I would like that. And we said, oh, okay, that could address a resource concern. And we gave them a second contract. So it's one buffer out in the field and two contracts on paper. Okay, so when we're doing the review, when stacked buffers that are enrolled under different contracts have the same expiration date, the stacked buffers have to be re-enrolled under one offer. And they'll be combined into like one field and one offer. It'll become one contract. And this is, of course, if it meets all the eligibility requirements. So that goes without saying, it has to meet standards and specs, and the entire wider width has to be necessary to address the resource concern. So in this case, if it has the same expiration date, FSA will run the tariff scenario as one field and one contract, and we will present that to the technical side and ask them for the conservation plan. We can't change the line work in MIDAS until after October 1st, the new fiscal year, so that we can actually pay them for the last year of it. And a huge part of mentioning this today is because FSA needs NRCS to document on the status view that the entire width of the buffer is necessary to address the resource concern. So if we're combining that 120-foot buffer and 180-foot buffer to have a 300-foot buffer, we need NRCS to document on the status review that it's necessary, and then to do the conservation plan for that full 300-foot buffer, even though the CLU layer won't reflect it yet. When the stacked buffers under different contracts have different expiration dates, so say one is expiring this year and one expires a few years from now, and it meets eligibility requirements, of course, the acreage in the contract that's expiring in the current year has to be added to the contract that isn't expiring for a few more years. And we do this by revising the contract and a conservation plan modification. So for the contracts that'll be modified to include an expiring buffer, we have to wait until October 1st, again, so we can actually pay the last year. And then at that time, we modify the CLU layer. So this is kind of trippy because we're actually letting the one contract expire, which is like the thing we do not do. We don't let re-enrollments expire and think we can get it back in, but we have to in this case. So we will allow them to lapse, and then after October 1st, then that's when we're going to add that acreage that we let lapse into the contract that isn't expiring yet. And we'll use the effective date in our software as October 1st of 2023 for this year. And then that's when we'll say, hey guys, so we updated our COU layer. We need you now. And that's when we'll ask you to modify the conservation plan. But one catch is that FSA still needs the status reviews by July 6th or as soon as possible, because we need to know if this cover meets. And we can't tell someone to let their cover lapse and trust us that we'll modify the conservation plan and the contract later to put it in if we don't even know the feedback of what the cover's like, because it may not qualify, but we need to know. Okay. So if there are fields on an expiring contract that aren't part of the stacked buffers, you know, say basically there's a couple fields, some are stacked, some aren't. The ones that aren't stacked need to remain on the re-enrolling contract. So we'll do a terrace scenario just for those fields, and we'll ask you to help us handle that re-enrollment like normal, and we'll request a conservation plan. And then the ones that are stacked won't be included on the re-enrollment offer, but we'll add that to the modified contract later, and we'll request another conservation plan modification later. So it's a little bit of a challenge for the workload, but we'll get it done. If a participant does not agree to combine the buffers and their site-specific scenario does require it, say just based on which buffer is expiring, or if one would be too narrow to address a resource concern, and they opt to terminate, and there are additional fields on the contract that remain, then FSA will look at that on a case-by-case basis. A lot of this, I need to clarify, the overwhelming majority of this is FSA's responsibility. We are making the determinations for it and figuring out what can stay and what can go, but we have to base that on the feedback we get from NRCS. And that's why you telling us if a full buffer width is needed is crucial, because that's the way we're going to be able to combine these contracts. So NRCS has to document that a minimum design specification in excess of the 120 feet for a grass filter strip, or anything in excess of 180 feet for riparian buffers is needed to accomplish the purpose of the practice. And if it was enrolled originally when 300 feet was allowed, we need you to say, yes, all 300 feet are needed. It's addressing, these couple resource concerns and it's doing its job. Or if it's been more recent and it's a max of 250 feet, we need you to say all 250 feet are needed and why. And if we'll work with you and help figure out exactly what documentation we need. But again, the CREP Tech Guide has the history to show what was in place at what time. And if in most cases we're missing some of this prior documentation, so this is when we need you to document it, and we can put it on the status review or in a Con 6 note. But either way, we need to put it in the CRP folder on the FSA side of the office. Excuse me. Okay, moving on to another fun topic, the whole field review process. There's a memo from January 22nd of 2020, and this is still the most current version of the memo, but nothing has changed, so we did not update it. This is when FSA has to review buffer practices for whole field issues to ensure buffers are filtering something and don't need to be scaled back. In a nutshell, a few years ago, there was some national attention in a couple states that had whole fields of a filter strip or a buffer practice. So the outlook was, well, what's it filtering? And so we heard about some other states going through an intense review process and having a lot of national oversight and jump teams and things that we weren't looking forward to having in our state. So we decided to come up with kind of an internal review process to kind of keep it within our control and scale back if needed, and just kind of look carefully at those initial determinations that were made to make sure that if we do have an entire field that is enrolled in a filter or buffer strip, that it is in fact acting like a filter or buffer strip, and it was an appropriate original enrollment. So buffers that previously were enrolled in CREP can be re-enrolled, but only if the enrolled acreage meets the conservation criteria that applied at the time of original enrollment. So FSA will evaluate the field as to how the practice should have originally been enrolled to address the original resource concern. And then depending on the type of water body being buffered, we may have to reduce that acreage that is eligible to be re-enrolled. This is just a screenshot of the memo itself. If you don't have a copy of it, feel free to ask me for it if you need to see it for any reason. Again, these are parameters that, these are decisions that FSA is making in conjunction with the county committee. But what we need from you is that feedback of what's out there. If there's water bodies on surrounding a field, we want to know about it. There's wetwoods, we want to know about it, because we can use information from you and the water bodies that you see and the resource concerns you see to go back and look at the original policy and make sure we can justify that field and, try to keep in as much acreage as possible, as long as we can document that it is in fact addressing a resource concern based on the parameters that were in place when the contract was originally enrolled. We could talk about whole fields for a long time, but we don't have that kind of time today. One thing I wanted to mention tied to whole fields is not to forget about the 2.5-to-1 ratio. And one thing I guess I need to say is that the 2.5 is what stays and the 1 is what comes out of CRP. I think that's a rule of thumb that's easy to forget. So we have a lot of the expanded buffers in Maryland, and I think it's easy to forget that they fit the criteria for the rule of thumb for the 2.5-to-1. So for buffers that are on channelized intermittent streams, field ditches, isolated wetlands, that were offered based on the expanded buffer criteria of having an EI greater than 8, or if they were justified via hydric or floodplains, or hydric soils or floodplain soils, or for wildlife, the rule of thumb is the 2.5-to-1 buffer area, 2.5 buffer, and then 1 area not enrolled. So, for example, an offer for a 250-foot buffer on predominantly floodplain soils would only need to have 100 feet of unenrolled field adjacent to it. So, admittedly, it is not fun to calculate. Until I actually started doing it myself to help out a short-staffed office. I was like, oh, that's not that bad. And I started doing it. I'm like, oh, this is terrible. It's not fun to calculate, but it does increase the acres that can remain in the program. And it is an option that FSA can consider when we are reviewing the whole fields at the time of re-enrollment, just to make sure that if we have a whole field that, it is buffering something. There's a lot more to the whole field review process, but we decided to make this a, 2.5-hour training and not a day-long training. So I'll chill on that for now, but we can always talk about it more in the future. And that is it for what I have so far.
All right. Just looking back to see if there's any additional questions.
Yep, we'll definitely send.
Yep, I think that additional questions were just around where to find the memo. And I sent that out to everybody. I just responded to the email that Steve sent yesterday. And I didn't realize that was not in the CREP technical reference until this week. So I'm gonna try to get that included. And then the question about whether the presentations would be sent out, and Erna said yes, that she would send them out. So I think that's it. If you do have any questions, I know we've run a little bit long today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Laura or I at any point. We try to get back to you as quickly as possible. As soon as we have an answer to your question, sometimes we consult each other to see if we can find out the best answer. But we are here for you and are willing to answer any and all questions. Laura, do you have anything else to say?
No, I don't. Just thanks for joining today. And, this is an overview. We have the upcoming CREP forestry workshops that will be, suitable for some of the people on the call. But if there's other training needs you have or things you guys want to talk about, just let us know and we can, focus future trainings on exactly what you want to talk about, rather than, tie up everybody. Basically, just let us know what you want us to talk about, and hopefully we'll see some of you at the CREP forestry workshops in the coming weeks.
All right. Well, I hope everyone has a great day, and we will talk to you all soon. Thank you.